and I will jump into our introduction. Okay. Can everyone see my screen? Yes, we're good? Okay,
Yeah,
fantastic.
thumbs up.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have you all here with us today. I'm Bernie Traversari. I'm the Director of Operations and Programs for the Society for Conservation Biology North America, and I am delighted to welcome you to the first session in our new policy series on ethics and conservation. Right off the bat, I want to mention that one of the things that makes this series so exciting for us is that we are co-hosting it and co-developing it with PanWorks, which is a nonprofit that works at the intersection of ethics and conservation. And I will let our speaker and PanWorks founder, Bill Lynn, explain a bit more about it in a few minutes. Before that, I just want to quickly go through an introduction to SCBNA for those of you that may not be familiar with our organization. We are a professional scientific society that is dedicated to advancing the science and practice of conserving Earth's biological diversity. And we strive to provide an environment that welcomes, supports, and empowers everyone that is involved in conservation. And we do this through a variety of different means. We develop professional development opportunities for folks, including webinars, but also workshops and skill building activities. We have a biannual conference, the next iteration of which is taking place in Milwaukee, Wisconsin on July 12th through 16, 2026. And in association with the Global Society for Conservation Biology, we also host a number of research and publication journals that are available to both members and non-members. So we do a lot of things. And I always tell folks, if you're not familiar with SCBNA and all the things that we do, and you're not a member yet, I strongly encourage you to join. We actually have a free membership tier available to everyone. So I will be including the links to all of our membership pages after I finish with my introduction. But this is a quick QR code. If you want to scan it, it'll take you directly to our membership page so you can join. We would love to have you. Now, as I mentioned before, SCBNA does a lot of things to promote our work in conservation. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention that everything we do is volunteer-led. All of the programs we have, especially our professional development programs, are led by volunteer committees. And this series in particular is being developed by our North America Policy Committee. The Policy Committee broadly works to bridge the gap between conservation science and policy, and it attempts to do that in a variety of different ways, by engaging with members in chapters, by signing on to policy letters and statements, and developing toolkits for those letters, with regards to issues that are of relevance to the society, and also by creating professional development resources like today's series, but also others that are available on our website. And I'll include links to that as well. Our policy committee, like all of our committees, is made up of a group of fantastic individuals, including our chair, Lauren Jonitis, who is unfortunately not able to join us today. And we are always looking for new members to join. So if you're interested in conservation, if you're interested in policy, if you're interested in ethics, I encourage you to send an email to the address on the screen if you're interested in being a part of our committee moving forward and helping us develop other cool resources like today's webinar. Okay, so before I talk a bit more about our series and today's session, I want to go through a couple of quick housekeeping items. So first of all, if you would like closed captions for today's presentation, I strongly encourage you to turn those on your end. Or unfortunately, even if we turn them on our end, they won't show up on the recording, and it's likely that they won't show up on your screen. So we recommend that everyone does this on their own. In addition to that, I want to mention that the chat function for today is limited to messages that will go only to the co-hosts of today's meeting. So that's me and Bill. The reason for that being is because we want to manage questions coming in, especially through the Q&A session, a bit more effectively. So you won't be able to interact with others in the meeting, just for the two of us. In terms of video, please feel free to have the video on or off for the entirety of the meeting. We don't have a preference. I find that it's more interactive if folks have their video on, but feel free to do what works best for you. And then last but not least, we have also disabled the reactions function for today's video, with the exception of the raise hand function for our Q&A session. And again, that's just to facilitate the Q&A process and the interactive nature of the session, which Bill will explain a bit more in a few minutes. Okay, so why are we developing our ethics and conservation series? This really stems from a previous webinar series that we developed in early 2025 that focused on state wildlife issues and public wildlife values. There were a number of issues that came up throughout this series, but one that received the most traction was this question of ethical considerations in conservation. And so we wanted to develop a series that really focused on this particular issue and that attempted to answer some of the aspects of this particular question. And so we are envisioning this to be a long-running series. We have 2 sessions scheduled before the end of this year. This is one of them. We'll have another one scheduled for next week. So if you're interested, I strongly encourage you to register for that one as well. But then we will also be organizing a couple of additional sessions in early 2025. So I encourage everyone to be on the lookout for additional information through our social media channels and our website, so you can register for those as well. And they will all be co-developed with PanWorks. Okay, last but not least, I want to introduce our session for today. So today we'll be focusing on Ethics 101. How do we think about ethics in wildlife conservation? And our speaker today is Bill Lynn, founder of PanWorks, a really good friend of mine, really great partner of SCBNA. And so at this point, I would like to turn it over to Bill so that he can introduce himself, tell us a bit more about PanWorks, and lead us through today's presentation. Thank you so much, Bill, for taking the time to be here today and present for us.
My delight, Bernie. Thank you very much. Let me share my screen with you folks. Can you all see that? Thumbs up? All right. Excellent. Excellent. Okay. So today we're talking about Ethics 101. And as Bernie said, this was developed because of the lively interests and the questions that folks had about a previous state agency set of presentations that we had done. Let me see here. There we go. First of all, I just want to thank Bernie so much for helping develop this series, and thank the Society for Conservation Biology North American section for being willing through its policy committee to grapple with these issues. These issues were central at the beginning of the formation of the Society for Conservation Biology. And if I was there at that time, and if you go way, way back, you'll find entire issues of the journal devoted to questions of values in conservation. That's fallen off to some degree as questions of ethics and values have become more professionalized and handed over to professional ethicists and whatnot. At PanWorks, we're very interested in reversing that trend because we think ethics is something we do, think of, practice all the time, whether it's latent or manifest, whether it's out in front of our consciousness or it's behind as a presupposition. So we hope through this occasional series, over time, we'll be able to in some sense, re-enliven the discussion of ethics in conservation biology. Now, a little bit about PanWorks. PAN stands for People, Animals, and Nature. PanWorks is an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan ethics think tank. We take ethics, we infuse it into science and policy dedicated to the well-being of animals and the flourishing of people and animals together. We have about 26 people globally who are actively involved in PanWorks. We're actively involved in a variety of publication and education endeavors. And if you'd like to learn more about us, the link is there at the bottom, panworks.io. Now, for this occasional series, we want it, first of all, to be very conversational. So, first names. I'm Bill. I probably should have changed my name in the on the screen here, but please call me Bill. Um, and we also want to kind of slow this discussion of ethics down. There's no rush, that I point at the very bottom there. Since this is going to be an occasional series, we don't need to rush through all of what ethics is, etc. We can take our time to explore it together. In order to facilitate that and to make it concrete, which is something that PanWorks is very concerned about, taking ethics and bringing it down from the clouds and making it very concrete. We have paired theoretical discussions with practical discussions. Um, and more about that in a little bit later. As we go through, in order to keep it conversational, if you have a point of clarification, I'm not making sense, please use the raise hand function, and your name and screen will come to the very top of my list, and I can pause and we can discuss your point of clarification. If you have a point of agony, something you have to say, you think I'm saying something wrong, or my perspective on something is not right, please save that for discussion. Those can take a long time, and those are better had as a discussion moment. Now, most of the time, when people think about ethics, they think about scandal or they think about very abstract ethical theories. And that is often how ethics is talked about. Someone introduces themselves as ethics. They say there are three broad ethical theories. There's consequentialism, like utilitarianism. There's deontology, such as animal rights. And there's virtue ethics, which is virtue ethics. And then they start talking about those theories, and you're left with lots of theoretical knowledge, but unclear about what those theories may mean, how they work together, how they apply to the world. We're using an approach to ethics developed by Mary Midgley that we call conceptual tools, where you break down ethical theories into the precise conceptual tools that they make available for you. And you use these concepts as tools to do work in the world, to help you think about what's going on in the world, to help you act in the world. So it's this conceptual tool approach that we're going to be using to think about ethics. This conceptual tool approach really makes ethics accessible to people and doesn't keep it behind closed doors or gatekept. And finally, to pair with my presentation today, which is a little more theoretical, talking about the concepts of ethics and how it applies to public policy, we're going to be honored to have Becky Nemec with us next week. She's talking about messaging and wildlife protection ballot initiatives and the relation that foundational ethics theory has. It's actually called moral foundations theory, has to these issues. It's a wonderful illustration about how you can use ethics to deepen your understanding of what's going on in public affairs and public policy as it relates to wildlife conservation. So let's talk a little bit about ethics. This is Socrates drinking the hemlock. And his phrase, how we ought to live, which is his most famous and probably the most famous phrase used to describe ethics. How we ought to live is how Socrates encapsulated expressions of what's right, of what's good, of what's just, and of what's valuable. It's about thinking about what makes for a good life for human beings, but more than that, how is it that you do right by people, by other animals, and by nature? And by doing right by people, animals, and nature, I'm using an informal phrase there. I mean, thinking about what are the moral requirements for social justice, for ecological integrity, for animal protection, and for real sustainability. Those would be some of those concrete moral issues that you would be thinking about when you're thinking about ethics from a Socratic point of view. Now, ethics has two projects. One's a critical project and one's a visionary project. The critical project, and there's Martin Luther King, is about critiquing what's going wrong in society today. The visionary project is thinking about how we can do and become better, looking over the horizon, thinking about where we ought to be going, not where we are right now. So these are the two projects that describe most of ethics. There are common errors in ethics, and that is reducing ethical thinking down to religious rules or personal preferences or cultural customs or how you're feeling or subjective perspectives or thinking about ethics as entirely relative to a culture or an individual or as absolute truths, absolute rules that apply to everyone all the time in all places um, uh, throughout eternity. These are common errors for thinking about ethics. Ethics is much more of a conversation about how we ought to live. It may draw upon religion, on our experience, on how we're feeling, on our culture. And it certainly can learn a lot from those sources, but it can't be reduced to those sources. And that's a common error that often happens when we talk about ethics. Now, you folks are used to thinking about ethics and science in one of two ways. One having to do with the internal domain, the second having to do with the external domain. The internal domain of ethics and science is about research integrity, the integrity of science. So questions of data fabrication, analytic distortions, conflicts of interest, protecting human and animal subjects. Those are all ethical issues that you'll read about in a quote, ethics of science book that apply to the practice of doing science. But then when you take science and you take it outside the laboratory or out of the field and you put it into practice, as either the making of new technologies or the making of public policies that are then used to guide what happens in our society. Then you're talking about the external domain of ethics and science. You're talking about the consequences of using science in the world. And here you have the misuse of science and questions of social justice, animal protection, ecological integrity, sustainability, and the like. What are the consequences for all those things from science? What are the ethical responsibilities of scientists for the consequences of the things that they discover, the things that they claim? So that's something you're probably all pretty used to. But there's another way of talking about this that's especially important for public policy that we don't often talk about. And that is this distinction. And I say it's a distinction. It's not a hard and fast rule, but it's a distinction between descriptive ethics and normative ethics. Descriptive ethics is trying to help us understand moral behavior and belief. It's trying to get down and learn about the ethical worldviews and practices that people exhibit in their lives as individuals and as groups. It's trying to describe and explain how ethics informs public policy. That's descriptive ethics. Descriptive ethics is paired with normative ethics. Normative ethics isn't so empirical in trying to study ethics in the world. It's more prescriptive. It's thinking about more directly how we ought to live in Socrates' sense. It's trying to understand what's right, what's wrong, what's just, what's unjust, what's of value, what's not of value, what's good, what's bad. It's also an attempt to articulate moral principles and duties and conduct to give us direction in the world, to help us see what it is that we ought to do in order to be moral, in order to act in such a manner that we do right by people, animals, and nature. So what we're doing in this first session, and it may run into two sessions, as I said, there's no reason to rush this. We're going to first talk about descriptive ethics and how it relates to public policy. And then we're going to talk about normative ethics and how it relates to public policy. Are there any points of clarification before I move on to the next section? We good? Okay. So let's talk about descriptive ethics and public policy. This is a protest at Oostervaardersplassen, a rewilding project in the Netherlands from 2018, I believe. Once again, descriptive ethics, much more empirical, studying how ethical worldviews and practices inform everyday life, all the way up to public policy. One of the insights from this is a sort of a grandchild student of Socrates. Socrates was the professor, so to speak, of Plato, and Plato was Aristotle's professor. And Aristotle has written some of the most consequential work in the early history of ethics. Important thing to say here is ethics is not a Western tradition. Ethics is a multicultural tradition, founded at a time where the Mediterranean world was intersecting the cultures of Libya, what we now call Africa, Asia, which we call Asia, and Europa, which was the emerging cultures of Europe. Aristotle says that politics is ethics writ large. What does he mean by that? He means a number of things, but the two I want to pick out here are that our politics and the policies that are always made as part of that politics is informed by our values, including our moral values. In fact, our moral values are particularly important because moral values are seen as trumping all other values. And it's that our politics and policy has consequences for people's lives. That could be people, animals, and nature, the lives of, the community of life of people and animals within that broader community of life. It has consequences, either good or bad. We can help or harm others. And for this reason, politics and public policy is always ethics writ large. This makes public policy a wicked problem. This is a much more modern term, in the sense that there's no technical fix. Public policy can be informed by science. It can be informed by technology. Science and technology can often help us with public policy, but they can't fix it. They can't resolve it completely. Why? Because public policy has many stakeholders with different values and different goals. There's no single technical fix, no silver bullet that will resolve the disputes over public policy. Moreover, those disputes are fundamentally moral conflicts. Whether it's about economics, environmental protection, social policy, it's always about moral conflicts with people having different values, calling on different facts to justify those values. It's about who or what counts or matters, who will be helped or who will be harmed. And these are very, very difficult issues in public policy that pertain to all public policy across the board. And this is why they're called wicked problems. Now, there is a myth, and this is often present amongst scientists and those who love technology. We call it the technocratic model, that science and expertise, and we can include technology in that, should lead directly into public policy. It gives us our answers. When you hear the Society of Conservation Biology or biologists or advocates in the environmental or in animal protection space talk about science-based policy, they're often thinking in terms of this technocratic model, that science gives us the answers and public policy is a difficult political process of putting those scientific answers into practice. There's a political model, and that is, it subsumes the technocratic model, but it sees a larger role for politics here. especially around questions of power and vested interest. It sees these elements of power and vested interest as getting in the way of science and technology, providing the answers that should be written into public policy. But the reality is that values drive all policy, particularly moral values. It's helpful to think about the fact, what's often called the fact value dichotomy. Think of that more of as a distinction here to express this. Values are the major driver of any political process. Facts matter, but facts are often marshaled according to the lenses of people's values. So you have, to put it in a famous phrase, alternative facts being used to justify different public policies that are driven by values. And then, of course, between all of this is a political process that can work well or can work poorly in terms of taking values and facts and turning them into public policy. Science and ethics play particularly important roles here. We could frame this in other ways, but science and ethics is an easy, readily understandable way to frame this. Science helps keep our facts transparent and accountable. When someone's lying about the Earth being flat, or the Earth being at the center of the universe, or climate change not being real, or nature doesn't exist, our science can call those facts into account. But you have to have science there to help make those facts transparent and accountable. We have systems for doing this. They work imperfectly. They're subject to political interference. But we have systems in government and public policy that help us think about doing this. We have nothing comparable with respect to values. But nonetheless, ethics helps keep our values transparent and accountable. When someone is lying about their values, or someone is articulating values that are reprehensible, such as, let's say, the Holocaust never happened, or what's wrong with slavery. Ethical discussions can make those, can keep that kind of value-based orientation accountable. Often those values are hidden behind a facade of language or a facade of other ideological perspectives, but they're still there. And ethics can help draw that out, make it transparent, and hold it accountable by critiquing it. So this is the model of how public policy gets made with respect to values, with respect to ethical values, that I want you to keep firmly in mind. Now, let me give you a concrete illustration of this with the northern spotted and barred owl controversy. In fact, we're thinking about having a whole session devoted to this, but let me just give you a quick summation. I was the ethicist who was called in to help design, train, and facilitate the barred owl stakeholder group, which made the initial decision and justified ethically the initial decision to conduct lethal management of barred owls for spotted owls. The justification for that experiment was that we'd have limited harm to barred owls, but we would perhaps protect the ability of spotted owls to survive in the wild, perhaps creating refugia where they could thrive. We conducted the removal experiment. The removal experiment failed. It slowed and in one spot stopped the decline of barred owls, but it's really not going to do anything long-term spotted owls, but it's not going to do anything long-term to prevent the spotted owls from going extinct. After that, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decided to institute a policy based on the experiment, which will kill not 4,000 owls over 10 years, which was essentially the experiment to see whether we could help spotted owls create a refugia, but would create a massacre of barred owls, about 500,000 over the next 15 years, with no end in sight after that. There were a variety let's go here. There were a variety of ethical concerns in this situation. In terms of the science, we had a species that was going extinct, and we were trying to figure out ways to help the spotted owl not go extinct. We explored through the barred owl stakeholder group and the whole recovery process a whole variety of ways to help the spotted owl in its competition with the barred owl. And at the time, and this is in about 2012, there was no other good answer than killing barred owls. But there were also ethical concerns. And these ethical concerns were primary with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the scientific concerns about losing a species and loss of biodiversity. And this was the ethical value of those owls and how people thought about those owls, how service members thought about those owls. The public, in terms of public commentary, was entirely against a control action against barred owls. There was a huge contingent within the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the other land and wildlife management agencies of the federal government against doing a lethal removal of barred owls as well. And of course, there were a variety of stakeholders that were concerned about that too. Here you had scientific interests, scientific values around biodiversity, about endangered species protection, being combined with ethical concerns about what it is that we owe spotted owls, what it is that we owe barred owls, how is it that we can make, and should we even make a trade-off between the two? And both of these perspectives triangulated in terms of creating the policy that we have today. Right or wrong, both of these helped create this policy. In this way, you can see that to understand a policy dispute, to properly describe and explain it, you require descriptive ethics. You don't have to take a position about an ethical issue per se to recognize that it's deeply embedded in conservation and wildlife policies of every sort. And whatever your perspective, unless you attend to those norms, those values, those ethics that are driving that conservation and wildlife public policy dispute and are embedded in the policies themselves, whether they're articulated or not, whether they're manifest or whether they're latent. Unless you attend to this descriptive ethics, you will not fully understand the public policy dispute. And without understanding that public policy dispute, you won't be able to resolve that public policy dispute. Let me pause here before I go on to the next discussion of normative ethics and conservation policy. Any points of information, points of clarification that I could share with you folks right now? If so, just click on that raise hand function and ask that question. Fred, you've come online verbally. Yes. Can't hear you, Fred.
There you go. What do you have a suggestion on what the best tool is for determining what the descriptive ethics are? In other words, for example, we often hear in wildlife management the idea of taking a public survey. Do you, or is that a way to go?
I have no objections to public surveys, but what I think you need, I think you need to use every tool that you have available, whether it's um, public surveys, whether it's focus groups, whether it's historical and archival analysis, whether it's the conceptual analysis of the public policies themselves. There's a whole variety of tools that are out there. Whatever tool works to give you insight into these public values, those are the tools you need to use. Are you thinking of a particular tool in
Well,
general or
we often
specifically?
hear, sort of a quick fix is to take a public survey and add up the votes.
I
And
see what you're thinking.
80% of Washingtonians don't want to kill the barred owls, but 20% do. So then who
Yes.
is it a majority wins, or what is the results of a descriptive ethics
Yeah.
study?
Yes. Okay. So that's a different issue. Okay. I know it has to do with surveys, but let's look at surveys as being one important tool in our quiver to help us understand the descriptive ethics side of things. But there's also a way of this, what you're articulating is much more of a normative approach.
Okay.
And this is called the preference model. Okay. We take a survey, we find out what the preferences are, and then that tells us what the normative answer ought to be.
Yeah.
The descriptive ethics approach is, that's a start. That's the empirical approach. But if you shortcut doing the normative ethics work of thinking about what's right or wrong by simply saying, oh, it's only a matter of social preferences, then you don't really address the underlying moral dispute there. It's it's one of those technocratic processes for doing this. Now, this is often done because people are very concerned about appearing objective and value neutral, especially when they're scientists or they're working in public agencies. And those are really important values, not to be, invidiously biased. And not to be taking and to be careful about the kind of public positions you take when you're a public service servant. I get all that. That's really, really important. But that doesn't solve, once again, the policy issues. Um, and it also has a false sense of how science interfaces with ethics. I'll slide back to the screen before. Here we go. Ethics and science are coupled at the hip. Facts and values are coupled at the hip. Are neutral. We could, whether it's because of the ethics that governs the internal domain of science or the impact that our findings of science have on people, animals, and nature, there's always ethical issues embedded there. So while it's important to be not to avoid invidious bias and being objective in that sense is really admirable, it's important not to let that slide over into pretending you're value free or value neutral, and you can simply decide a moral question by taking a poll.
Yeah.
Other questions before we go forward? Remember, we do want to keep this dialogic, so don't be shy about, asking questions and stuff. There's also no rush to get through this. We can explore whatever issues here you think need to be explored. All right, then. Let's move on. Let's talk about normative ethics and conservation policy. Remember, normative ethics is prescriptive. It's about thinking, it's about practice, thinking how to put into practice Socrates' suggestion of how ethics is being how we ought to live, understanding right and wrong, good and bad, etc., articulating the moral principles that we can live our individual and collective lives by. So I'm just going to pick, this is very complex, and this is often what ethicists want to talk about, is the normative side of things. I'm going to talk about one element, one set of conceptual tools having to do with moral value that are the keystone questions that drive everything else when it comes to normative ethics. And that's this question about moral value, moral standing, and moral community. There is this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic value, sometimes called inherent value or instrumental value. To have intrinsic value means you're valuable in and of them yourself. You matter. Or something is valuable in and of itself. It matters. An individual human being, an ecological community, as examples. To be instrumentally valuable means that you're not intrinsically valuable. You're not valuable in and of yourself. You're only valuable insofar as you're a tool or a resource for others. We often refer to that as instrumental value, and people differ about what has intrinsic value and what has extrinsic value. And those differences apply to people, animals, and nature alike. If you have intrinsic value, you're part of a larger moral community. This gray oval circled in blue. If you don't have intrinsic value, you're outside the moral community. This white circle, this white area circled in green. And the dispute is whether you fall outside or inside the moral community. If you're inside the moral community, you have standing. You are morally considerable. We have to think about your intrinsic value, your well-being. And if you make a claim to the community that your well-being is harmed, or someone else makes a claim about you, or let's say an ecological community or a group of animals, that their well-being is harmed, as long as they're within the moral community, you have to account for that. You have to be responsive to that, because they're beings or things with intrinsic moral value. If you're not inside the moral community, it doesn't matter. We've had plenty of times through history where certain kinds of people have been regarded as outside the moral community of a certain group. Think about slavery in this context. Think about the status of women 300, 400 years ago, where they were in the moral community, but they were at the edges, where men were at the center. And basically, rich, powerful men were at the center, and everybody slid towards the edges. We can also think about this with respect to animals. Currently, we have debates and public policies that implicitly, not explicitly, but implicitly recognize the great apes as creatures of having intrinsic moral value. So we're minimizing research that uses great apes. We're developing sanctuaries where great apes that have been used in research are being sent. Other animals aren't so lucky. Think about all the farmed animals, the billions and billions of animals that are farmed through factory farming, go through CAFOs, and experience terror at the end of their lives. You don't have to be a vegan or a carnist to recognize that that's a reality of our world today. Those folks stand outside, well outside the moral community, whereas those great apes, at least in our society, are just perhaps on the edge of that moral community. Conservation biology itself was founded with the notion that nature, ecological systems, have intrinsic value. There's debate in this regard. So that would be ecological systems would be inside our moral community here. It would have standing. That's one thing that conservation biologists do is they stand up for the well-being of nature. Arnie Nace has this wonderful essay, Will the Defenders of Nature Please Rise, which expresses this, which was a formative essay in Soulet's thinking and articulation of what are the primary principles and the mission of conservation biology. But there's a real fight within conservation biology itself and many other places about how we think about animals in nature as and where they fit. Do we only think about animals as important to the moral community if we think about them as a collective, as, let's say, species or populations or members of biotic communities, but not as individuals? That's still a debate that is going on, and we will come to discuss those debates. But this question of moral value standing in community is the keystone question from which everything else in ethics with respect to conservation biology, with respect to people, animals, and nature arises. Now, this results in what we call value paradigms, sort of broad worldviews of how we think about what has value and who we have responsibilities to. There's the anthropocentric value paradigm, where only human beings have moral value, or have the vast majority of moral value, and everything else can get in the back of the bus. There's the ecocentric or ecocentrism value paradigm, where ecological wholes are regarded as having moral value. And there's the biocentric paradigm, in which individual life forms have moral value. There are variations on these. So let's say with the biocentrism, there's sentientism, which thinks about not all life per se, but life that is sentient, that's aware, that feels, that can be harmed, that can suffer. And that's their focus, not so much plants and other living beings, unless they see those plants and other living beings as sentient themselves. There's sapiocentrism, where it's not so much whether you can feel and suffer, rather it's more the higher faculties of thinking and awareness, that what's often called personhood in the legal literature. But these are variations of biocentrism. And then there's something called geocentrism, which thinks about people, animals, and nature as all having moral value, and that moral value being able to scale from individuals up into communities and systems. So from the individual to the entire community of life. These four value paradigms, and people cut it up in other different ways. That's okay. It's the meaning that matters here, not the terminology per se. These four value paradigms help describe how different groups of people think about these values. So to take it back to the barred owl example, the very first thing I did in training the barred owl stakeholder group was teach them about moral value standing in community, teach them about value paradigms, and then help them explore their own sense of moral values with respect to people, animals, and nature, the value paradigm that they held, and how to be in conversation with others vis-a-vis the values that others hold, how others see moral value, moral community, what value paradigms they hold. That was a bit of intellectual work, no doubt about it. We had a whole variety of exercises to explore that. But what that did is it brought to the surface those latent moral values that they were already operating with, taught them how to exchange about that with each other, and substantially developed a moral conversation amongst these individuals where beforehand they had been unable to articulate the moral values that informed their own and other people's perspectives about barred owls. Allison, yes, please.
I'm concerned because we've excluded barred owls from our moral community, and I understand from the literature that we've caused them to be a problem in ecosystems because of the way we've logged the forests.
Hmm.
This is a human creation, a human problem.
So what point are you asking me to clarify? Or have you got a point of agony here that we should go back to in discussion?
This is a point of agony
Okay.
that that we're exterminating this species, and that this is a problem that we created. And
Yes,
why
yeah,
should we be excluding them from the moral community?
yes, it's a very good question. Let me come back to that in our discussion, which we're very close to getting to. I really thank you for raising that issue. Maybe it's make sure you get in you get in there and get that hand up very quickly when we start the discussion, and we'll get there. Any points of clarification about moral value, moral community, value paradigms? I should say any other. Okay, we can skip that. Um, Let me just say very quickly, and we're going to return to this in a future session. There's basically two approaches to dealing with these normative issues. There's the dogmatic approach. I have the truth. You need to accept my truth and change the way you think, or that change the way you do things. St. Thomas Aquinas is saying there is one truth and error has no rights, is one way of expressing that. But there's also a deliberative approach. And this is the approach we're trying to encourage through this series. It's not a question of who is right or wrong per se. It's what they're right about. Ethics is not about absolute truth versus absolute falsity. There's often deep insights from different perspectives, from different moral theories that can be brought together to triangulate on a deeper and better understanding of what those moral issues are. And the conversation around around that needs to be deliberative. You need to be willing to reflect yourself, as well as be in conversation with others, to recognize that you may have insight, but you also may need other insights or could be wrong in certain situations, and vice versa with others. So to use the barred owls again, I went in while I was hired as a facilitator, and I'm technically a sort of a neutral convener of the conversation. I do not believe we can kill our way back to biodiversity. So I was profoundly skeptical about the removal experiment on an intellectual level. But I learned enough and learned from my colleagues that there really wasn't an alternative at that time. And if the situation for barred owls was so dire that if we wanted to do something, killing barred owls was the way to do it in that period of time. Now, I may have been wrong about that. And I'm always willing to say that and to admit that I have been wrong and will continue to be wrong, and I will continue to change my mind. But at that moment, my being open through a deliberative approach helped change my mind. And that deliberative approach between the Barred Owl stakeholder group changed a lot of people's minds who were initially opposed to a removal experiment. Doesn't mean it was the absolute right thing to do. One could still make legitimate arguments that we ought not to trade off some wildlife's lives for others. But still, I'm trying to illustrate the deliberative approach as opposed to a dogmatic approach here. Once again, values drive public policy. Now, we could think about this, this deliberative and this dogmatic approach with respect to the national wolf conversation as well. And we can help think about our triangulation diagram here. There's a lot of discussion about wolf science and about the science of wolf recovery. And wolf recovery has virtually nothing to do with science, even though the science can be very helpful when we choose to recover wolves, to understand wolf recovery in terms of their reproduction, in terms of their predation, in terms of their impacts on local human populations. That's all can be important, but that's not what wolf recovery is about. Wolf recovery is about the ethics. And if we want to understand the public policies that currently exist that are profoundly anti-wolf, we can go back to the science to understand some of that, but we really have to go back to the ethics, the norms, the values, the culture that is driving the anti-wolf debate. But to solve the wolf debate, this triangulation, the values model of public policy is also necessary. We need to think about what is the right relationship we ought to have with wolves. And that will help inform the kind of public policies that science will help us develop. If we see wolves as outside our moral community, a threat to human well-being and livelihoods, then we're never going to develop policies that allow for wolves to recover in more than a tiny fraction of their range. And that tiny fraction always being very tenuous so that wolves can be wiped out very quickly if we get an opportunity again. You see this in the Rocky Mountain states that have enormously, I'll call them vicious policies towards wolves, keeping wolves at such a small level of recovery when they could have much larger populations that they could be wiped out quite quickly if those states and those state governments have an opportunity to impose that kind of public policy. If, however, we think of wolves as part of our moral community, to whom we have more responsibilities to help them flourish on the landscape, then we're going to develop very different kinds of public policies. And this illustrates the normative ethics side of how you solve public policy programs, not just describe them and understand them, but take a step beyond that and try and resolve them. It's not that the two are contrary to one another, but they're not exactly the same thing. And you need both with respect to wildlife conservation and the protection of biodiversity and animal protection if you're going to make a progress forward. So here we are. To solve conservation policy disputes, you require not just descriptive ethics, but normative ethics in which to do so. And with that, we're done with the formal portion of this presentation. Let's get to those questions of agony. But also, one of the things we want to do with respect to future sessions of this occasional series is we want to be able to address those questions about ethics and policy, conservation and wildlife that most interest you. So any suggestions you have that you would like us to consider, we want to hear, and I'm going to pull out pen and paper and write those things down. Let me stop sharing this screen and go to Wendy. It's lovely to see you, Wendy.
Nice to see you, Bill. Hello. Thank you for this webinar. Fantastic. I feel like I've learned a lot. Ethics is always hard for me to grasp, I think, for some reason. But so when you were talking about scientists and being objective and not taking a position, it got me thinking about the American Wildlife Values Project that Manfredo et al. Did in 2018. And they basically found that wildlife agency people tend to be utilitarian or traditionalist in their wildlife values, whereas the American public is more mutualist. So, I mean, that's kind of the rub. That's where we're at with the wolf debate, with the grizzly bear debate, with like all of these carnivore debates, with the barred owl debate, I feel like, is that we have such a disconnect between agency biologists versus academic biologists versus the public. I mean, I think that that's a huge problem, and that's why we keep getting kind of these perverse decisions on grizzly bears and wolves from from agencies, etc. So if you want to comment on that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Sure, I'd love to comment on that. My experience is very different. And I think one of the reasons why Manfredo, et cetera, came up with that is they haven't spent enough time in the right conditions talking to these agency officials. Because what I hear when I do trainings about ethics is if we have, well, I should say if we have enough time so I start to get to know people, I literally have agency people coming up to me, bursting into tears and saying, "This reminds me why I wanted to work with wildlife in the first place. This speaks to these latent moral values that hailed me, that brought me into this field. And when I got into graduate school for my master's in wildlife policy or wildlife science, and then when I got into the agency, the culture suppressed that. The culture silences that. The culture punishes those concerns. And it has to do with this culture of scientism, of technocracy, of value-free perspectives that isn't nuanced, that is very old traditional conservation. But I think there's a lot more agency and science folks out there who feel like you do, Wendy, and who feel like the public, who are mutualists. But their culture doesn't allow them to say that. And I also think there's a bit of groupthink that starts to take place over time that causes people to gravitate towards those dimensions. It's a kind of way of justifying and understanding your practice over time when it violates your deeply held moral beliefs. So I don't think we're as far off with respect to individuals as that study expresses. I think we're way, way off in terms of the cultures of conservation, of wildlife management. And that's where changing those cultures, changing that education, changing the reward system for what's valued in those agency cultures, in those academic cultures, is what we need to be focused on in that regard. Amarok, yeah. Well, first of all, Wendy, did you have a counterpoint you wanted to share?
No, I was just going to say thanks, and I think that's a really well, actually, I do now that I think about it.
Okay.
So Carnes et al., I think 2018, that's Jeremy Bruscotter's student, did a survey of biologists to see if they thought grizzly bears had been recovered, and this is during the last delisting crisis. And agency biologists by far thought grizzly bears had been recovered and should be delisted versus academic biologists who thought the opposite. So, but having, I totally agree with you. There are some people in agencies that are fabulous and share our ethics, and it's sad some of them get pushed out of their jobs. So I'm just thinking, I just was at the 7th International Human Bear Conflict Workshop, and we had this fantastic black bear biologist here in Colorado who was with CPW and did amazing research and basically got shoved out of the agency, which is really sad. So I agree, there are definitely great individuals. But I think there's sort of a disconnect between academic versus agency biologists, and I feel like the Manfredo paper, actually they did studies in individual states determining kind of values of agency people.
Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough.
Thank you.
I didn't know you were working with bears, Wendy. I think that's wonderful. It's wonderful you're bringing your skills to that. And I'm very sorry to hear about what happened to the CPW bear biologist. This has happened to a number of biologists of note over the last 10, 15 years. And this obviously is another example of that. Amarok, please. It's nice to see you.
Yes, thank you so much for being here, Bill. I always enjoy having a chance to hear your brain at work and allow us to marinate on these thoughts ourselves. I believe in my lifetime, we have seen advances in the normative ethics discussions and even awareness that normative ethics needs to be part of the discussions. I think in large part it's been helped by larger than life size people like Jane Goodall, which the world recognizes. We also have larger than life events in politics, however, that force everything backward. For instance, the current administration in America. And so I'm wondering your views. One, during what period of time do you think we've seen the most advances in this understanding and awareness to bring normative into the discussion? And like what examples you might think of to tell us? And then secondly, given that we do have this backlash of this type of administration and all the loud, though small, but loud oppositional voices that always control the narrative, what are your recommendations for moving forward under an administration like this to keep the normative ethics discussions afloat?
I always appreciate the small, pointed questions that you ask that aren't complex at all. So I too believe in moral progress. But I don't think there's one period of time that shows a lot of moral progress over another, because there's often a buildup then with a lot of important work, and then a threshold is reached. And you might say, well, that period is the most important period, but then you're ignoring the buildup. So from the late 1890s through the 1960s, we had an enormous wave of building concern for the well-being of animals, for animal protection. And that eventually rolls over into academic fields like animal studies, into the animal rights movement, into more of the animal protection and humane movements, animal welfare movements. Those really come at, sort of the latter stages of the last century, which I'm old enough to have lived through parts of. But I'm not sure that was that stage in the 60s beyond was the most important, because without the work of Henry Salt and Henry Moore in Britain and the United States and other folks who are working very, very hard in this regard, we probably wouldn't have had reached that threshold. So I think, I don't want to say there's any one point in time. And part of the reason why I don't want to say that is because it ties in with your second point, a question. Right now, we are dealing with a regime that is extremely anti-animal, anti-nature, and is pushing back a whole variety of progress made since the 1970s in terms of public policy on all fronts is pushing those back. The vision they are pushing forward to is what's technically called the Lochner era, which is a period from 1890 through 1930, where property rights and the rights of corporations are the primary concerns of law and policy in the United States. It's associated with the period of time of the robber barons. And that's the vision. When you think about it, and when you look at the research, that's the vision they're going for. But there are folks like you in the sciences, and like you, Amaroq, personally, but like folks who are here in the sciences and in advocacy who are pushing hard against that. And that push is not only slowing that juggernaut down, it has the prospects of tripping it up and pushing it back, but over time. So it's a historical process, and it needs to be seen as part of that. The last thing I'll say is that I think the conservation, the environmental, and the animal movements have done themselves no favor by not building the institutions of power and culture that would allow them to exercise far more control over the situations we find ourselves in now. The right wing in this country started doing that in the 1950s, 1960s, and has built up an enormous and very wealthy infrastructure of media groups, of legal teams, of religious organizations, of nonprofits, of think tanks that all are working not in lockstep, but closely coordinated to push their agenda forward, even though their agenda is a minority perspective of the vast majority of Americans. We never did anything like that. We never even came close. Why? Because we were caught in the technocratic model that we've got the science tells us the policy, and all we have to do is argue the science, and things will be resolved. We fail to build the political and ethical capital in which to achieve our aims. For my perspective, like with respect to wolves, I think we've lost the wolf wars. The first wolf war was one of extermination. The second wolf war was one of recovery and a return to attempted extermination. There's going to be a third wolf war, but there will be a third wolf war. No matter the damage done the first two wars, there are going to be people like you and other people, scientists and advocates alike, working to push that forward. But what we need to do is be smart about it. We need to develop those institutions of power and culture that help us redirect policy in the United States and elsewhere. Who's next? Peggy Clark. Hey, Peggy, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Oh, hi, Peggy.
So one thing I was curious about is there's recent like campaign of wildlife photography called like Capture Coexistence. Project Coyote is doing, and it's basically like it's kind of wildlife photographers who are taking pictures of using photography of carnivores, like usually like coyotes and bobcats and other species especially species that tend to have like very few protections, and raising awareness of their value and the reality of killing contests. And seems to me like just like ethical consideration of species like coyotes and bobcats seems to be like relatively new, and that there hasn't been a whole lot of consideration given to them because they're not endangered. I was wondering, like, what would we need to do if just kind of to raise awareness of it? And do you think photography is effective at just showing that there's like different values, that many people value them and don't see them just as like resources or like nuisances or pests?
Absolutely. And
I was wondering like how new that is, that people start seeing this way.
I don't think it's well, let me break your comment into a couple of pieces. I don't think the use of photography in this way is new. The use of photography to try and encourage a Be Kind to Animal campaigns in the early 1900s was very profound. So too, photography being used to promote big game hunts, trophy hunting, is also out there. So it's not as if photography is a tool that is just used for the protection of wildlife. Photography is a tool that can be used for many purposes around wildlife. I do think that you're right, however, that the sustained ethical conversation around felids is lagging behind canids. The reason for that is, while there's been lots of talk about ethics in academic circles, There was very little talk about ethics as it applies to wildlife in public. And this was true until about the 2000s, when folks like Fred Kuntz and others who are many of whom are involved in PanWorks started to discuss explicitly ethics and wolf recovery and thereby predator recovery in public venues, and pushing that as a necessary feature that advocates, policymakers, scientists, no matter what your perspective is, need to take account of, taking account again of the descriptive as well as the normative ethical frameworks. That's starting to spread out to other species. And I think people using photography to talk about productive a human wildlife coexistence, compassion for other animals is a wonderful way to help push that message out there. Jit, you're next.
Yeah.
Hi there.
Hi.
I'm not associated with any conservation group, but I do support a lot of them, and I try to do advocacy locally here in New York State. What you just said is true. There's a lot of conversation that happens within conservation groups, but when I go out and talk to, folks in my social groups on a Friday night, they're hearing about, the plight of canids in the Northern Rockies for the first time. So I guess I want to know from your perspective, what approaches work best in trying to get people to bring our wild predators into their intrinsic moral circle?
Okay, that's a great question. Great question. But it's a difficult question because the issue of moral value and value paradigms is both a personal experiential issue as well as a cultural issue. And you have to address the full spectrum of possibilities across the board in that sense. So one of the best things that I've found is making those comparisons between people's experience with their dogs and cats, people's experience with their backyard wildlife, and then helping them think about how that experience informs how they think we ought to relate to wildlife afar or wildlife that's very different from those that they've had that experience with. I think many people are moved. Peggy's question about photography and art. Many people are moved by that. There's a theory called sentimentalism, the sentiments theory of the sentiments, that thinks about ethics as being primarily an emotional connection that is not reduced to emotion, but emotion is a point of departure by people saying, for some reason that moves me. Why? Why do I care? And investigating more deeply and using reason and evidence to flush that, to fill out that feeling. I think a lot of it has to do with education, whether that's K through 12 residential environmental experiences is important, but it's also important to have these courses, to have these conversations in your undergraduate and graduate training as scientists, as policymakers, just as citizens who are learning how to do right by others in the world. This is one of the major failures of wildlife management, wildlife science, conservation management, conservation science programs, is they don't have these deep dives and these ongoing conversations about the ethical dimensions of the field. Often people come out of those programs. They've not just not taken an ethics course because one course isn't going to do it. It's an it's a program that lacks ethics at its core. So they don't learn how to think about it natively. It seems like it's something off to the side and something instead of something that's deep and core to the very essence of the program. And it also has to do with larger moral political discussions. Um, Becky Nemec has this concept of pluralistic ignorance, that most people don't understand that their point of view is often reflected in a majority of people's points of view. They think they're all alone. Their perspective is not valued or marginal. And this is very true of people who believe strongly in animal and nature protection. Having these kinds of conversations more often on a national to local stage right out there is really important. If you think about how the conservative think tanks out there have made questions of conservative religion, conservative economics, conservative political values, everyday household discussion, points of discussion, we need to do the same sort of thing when it comes to thinking about animals and nature and coexisting with people. We haven't done that. So and then we could talk about specific techniques. And there are many techniques out there. I'm sure lots of people have lots of ideas, and I could learn a lot from what people have to say in that regard. Which is the question I want to turn around and ask to you. What do you find most effective with your folks when you're in discussion like out on a Friday night?
Well, I think fortunately, the crowd I'm with typically, I'm a data scientist by profession, so it's very, very technocratic line of work. Some of them are in academia, so I can talk to them about numbers and not so much about the ethical concerns, because for us as a group, it's obvious. But for the population at large, I feel like, at least in my area, people haven't thought about the issue long enough.
Yeah.
They haven't spent time thinking about the suffering that occurs, what leg hold traps actually do, the idea of an animal suffering, starving over a period of days in a leg hold trap. They don't process that. It's not that they're opposed to it, or rather, it's not that they agree with leg hold trap. They just haven't processed the magnitude or the type of suffering that the animal goes through. And the more they think about it, the more they'll come around. But the problem is to get that awareness in their bones. And that's the hard thing to do.
Yeah, it is very hard. And it's very hard to I sort of to build on your thoughts there. It's hard, especially in the North American context, because we don't have the policy and political environment that helps develop those conversations. A specific, for example, is in the European Union, the European Commission funds what they call platforms. These platforms are long-term, never-ending dialogues, not short-term stakeholder groups with hand-picked individuals that are mostly designed to return the answer an agency wants to hear. But these are platforms which everybody can stand on. That's the metaphor. Stand on equally, can have their say, and on a long-term basis, annual plenary and then regional, seasonal meetings, they talk about issues of animal protection, of agricultural animal policy, of social justice, of multiculturalism, etc. There are a whole variety of these platforms. And it really helps develop a conversation between governance and agencies and civil society. And that leaks into general conversations in the European Union itself. It's one of the reasons why the European Union policies on many items are so much more advanced than they are here in North America. So I really appreciate the importance of, there's lots to do culturally, politically, morally, and I really appreciate you bringing that out and highlighting it. Thank you for doing that.
Thank you so much, Bill.
Anna, please. Anna, were you the one with the barred owl question? Barred owl, spotted owl?
No, I was not, but that was
Okay.
yeah, that was a good conversation though. But yeah, first of all, thank you for this webinar. This is really informative. I guess I'm interested in getting your perspective. I don't have much background in policy really. I mean, I'm pretty deeply enmeshed in academia. But if I'm trying to think from the perspective of a policymaker, and you're trying to make some kind of a decision, and you're trying to manage all values from a whole bunch of different people who all have wildly different perspectives and wildly different values and what they think is important. It seems like, because I don't know how you would choose one set of values over another to use in making your decision. So it seems like the fairest thing to do would be to fall back on extrinsic value or utilitarianism. But I don't know, that isn't really ideal either. So I guess I'm just curious what you would think about sort of reconciling all those.
It's a good question. And if I could boil it down and see if I'm being fair to your sensibility here, it's really a question of how democracy takes different values and turns it into public policy. Is that fair? Okay, so there are, let me take you back into the 50s. In the 1950s, there was a political scientist named Robert Dahl. And Robert Dahl had this vision of pluralism. And what he meant by that is there's a plurality of values out there. Elections provide a mandate, or that's where the term mandate really comes from in our political discourse, for one set of values to be in ascendance. And then the public should shut up and they should let the politicians and the technocrats institute those values. And their institution of those values should be in proportion to the percentage of voters who voted one way or the other. This seemed this sort of new neutral electoral politics manner of distributing public policy in line with distributed values. But there's a different vision of democracy than that. That vision of democracy wants to hold voters at arm's length, and it's literally technocratic, and doesn't think that voters have enough knowledge, wisdom, to participate effectively in democracy. They basically can provide mandates in voting season, and that's it. There's another vision of democracy called deliberative democracy. This is much more the original democracy of Athens, where people sit down, they debate, they learn from each other, they reflect on their values, and they're trying to produce the best public policy, not just a public policy that distributes their values across the percentage who believe them, like, let's say, in a poll, or let's say in a vote, which is kind of a poll, if you think about it like that, but rather thinking deeply about what kind of values would best serve the well-being of the community, would best protect the rights of individuals, would best produce animal well-being or environmental protection or sustainability. That's a very different vision of politics. I must admit, that's the vision of politics I have. And there is a lot of scholarly work about how that actually is possible. It's possible to do, and it produces better public policy outcomes. So you're raising a really important point, and your point that you just made is the point that the technocrats fall on and saying, well, we'll just take a survey and we'll distribute our policies. We'll save so many wolves over here, we'll make so many other wolves available for trophy hunting over there. That seems just to them. And I'm not saying they're not trying to do right as they see it. But there's a deeper way to think about democracy, about policy, and the role that ethics plays in that. And that definitely is part of the presuppositions that I bring to this conversation. Does that help answer your question?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Okay, most welcome. Professor Cardellini, it's nice to see you here.
Thanks, Bill. Not a professor, but Um, so thanks for the talk, as always. It was really good. I just got a question about, you made a point about I can't remember who you mentioned. Was it Thomas Aquinas, who's very, strident in their position? I have the right position, everyone else is wrong. And then you lead into discussion on why deliberative discussion, ethical discourse is important so that we recognize the values, various values across a topic, and we come together and we have discourse over that and try to reach some sort of agreement, perhaps, on the best way forward. I wonder, you might not be surprised, but sometimes I think that the strident the strident position may be it's important to maintain that strident position. And in fact, the idea of agreement is a capitulation to a hegemonic position that is unethical. So are there topics or are there positions, or perhaps you can tell me why this feeling within me is wrong and why I should always maybe pursue deliberation and be open to agreeing with a position that I disagree with very strongly. But are there ever issues where it's important not to sort of capitulate, not to allow yourself to be drawn into a direction that makes you, well, you from a position where you think you've got the ethical right position to one that's less ethical. And in this regard, I'd say, harming animals for human gain, right? There's lots of there's a far bigger far more people have that position than one that is very strong and against violence to animals. But I don't feel like I should be agreeing with the position that it's okay to commit violence against animals.
So, yes, we've talked about this before, and it's a really important discussion. I agree with you 100%. I think there's times where you need to hold fast to certain positions, and that's certainly true for me. I think there is a distinction between being dogmatic, which really closed down to reason and evidence, rethinking your own positions and just asserting that it is the correct one, versus being principled. I think you can be principally committed and you can be in dialogue with others. And that doesn't mean that that dialogue necessarily produces agreement. And this is often true in deliberative democracies. Let's say you have a deliberative democracy that eventually is going to produce a report for public policy purposes. Almost always you have majority and minority versions of that report, which preserve the dialogue, which focus on those things that folks could agree upon, but also focus on those things that they don't agree upon and need more work. And taking that principled position and having that represented in, let's say, a minority perspective is absolutely critical for the processes of deliberative democracy, for the process of bringing ethics into a democratic conversation about fisheries, wildlife, conservation, animal protection, etc. So I don't think you're wrong. I also think, knowing you and having had discussions around issues that are deeply cared about, you represent precisely the kind of principled position that is non-dogmatic, even though you hold to your position and you hold to your guns. You still have that non-dogmatic sensibility that's open to reason and evidence. And I think that's what's key. Did you want to say anything more about that, Adam?
No, that's great. Thanks, Bill.
Okay, sure. Brina, it's nice to see you here.
Hi, Bill. Thank you. So this is something I've been tossing around in my mind for a while, and it's a good opportunity to raise the issue by you and probably also Fred Kuntz offline. I'm going to propose this idea with the realization that, state fish and wildlife agencies are never going to stop killing wildlife, right? That's just not realistic. But when we're talking about democracy in wildlife governance and democracy in wildlife management decisions, we know that most of the decisions that state fish and wildlife agencies make are based in values, and then they kind of use the science to retrofit a predetermined agenda. What if, with the exception of maybe white-tailed deer, from a biological imperative, they probably do need to be managed. But what if the state fish and wildlife agencies put out surveys to the public that they're supposed to serve and ask them, do you want black bears to be hunted? Do you want bobcats to be trapped? Do you want otters to be trapped? And then their wildlife policy should follow what the public wants. That would really be working for, the people and our values and what we want. Because right now, out of the gate, they just assume that any species whose populations are doing well, there's automatically a season on them. That's just their go-to. But to really be working in a democratic fashion and for the people, making policies based on their values, they really don't even know what people's values are. So just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, a couple of thoughts. One is it's in some ways the obverse, but it has the same technique as the technocratic model of taking a survey that delivers the answers they want to hear, and thus apportioning policies in terms of the values that are distributed through the population, that preference model. But as much as I like an element of the direct democracy of just taking a survey and engaging in an action after the context of the survey, I am someone who's committed to a deliberative model. And I think it's important to take those surveys as a matter of descriptive ethics, but that is a point of departure for a deeper conversation about normative ethics, about what we ought to do. So you may get a survey result that returns, let's say you do a survey in a region or set of neighborhoods that has had a lot of problems with bear attacks. When I say bear attacks, I should be more careful here. Bears breaking and entering to get food, etc. Not necessarily attacking people, but breaking and entering, and that's frightening people. You could have a lot of people who say, even a majority of people who say, yes, the bears need to be killed. We need lethal management of the bears. I would argue that that's misleading us, that while that might be a helpful moment in descriptive ethics, it's not a helpful moment in solving coexistence between human and bears, that we ought to have a more deliberative process about how it is we ought to compassionately coexist with other wildlife, with wildlife, and with bears. Do you see the distinction I'm making?
I do. Yeah. Especially when I think about who might be conducting the survey, like responsive management,
Yes.
someone who's kind of like an industry survey provider. Do we trust the results? Do we trust the methodology? Practically speaking, yeah, if we could have those more deliberative conversations, it would get us better answers. But yeah, thank you.
And if I could go back, remember the triangulation diagram that I showed? Your concern about trusting responsive management is valid because the language they use in their surveys is designed to elicit certain kinds of responses. This is one of the reasons why you need science, the science of survey, of administering surveys, to keep those surveys transparent and accountable. It's one of the reasons why you need an ethical discussion about those surveys to bring out the latent values that are being smuggled in there, even sometimes by people in responsive management who may not be realizing they're smuggling in latent values. This is just their worldview. They think they're doing the right thing, and by their lights, they truly believe they are, but in a deliberative process that's using science and ethics to make things transparent and accountable and triangulate on the best way to compassionately coexist with wildlife. it might show up some lacunae, some chasms of problems, of errors that responsive management is engaged in. I know I've certainly saw that when I've read some of those survey questions.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else next? We're running a little over time, almost 15 minutes over time. I'm happy to stay longer and chat with you folks about any questions, concerns you have. So where are we as a group? Okay, I don't see any other hands up, so I'm going to throw it back to you, Bernie.
Yeah, I had mentioned before that if folks wanted to stay, that was totally fine. It seemed like we were having a good conversation. If there are no other questions, Bill, then I think this is a good place to stop, at least for today. You know, we've mentioned that this will be a long-running series, so I'm sure we'll discuss the topics you mentioned and others in future sessions. But otherwise, I think this is a good place to stop, at least for today's session.
Well, thank you, folks. I really appreciate you being here. I love the questions that you asked and your patience as I ran through some stuff. And I really look forward to next week when Becky Nemec is going to come and talk about moral foundations theory and survey results on wildlife and conservation issues. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill, for taking the time again to present, answer questions, and also for working with us as part of the series. I look forward to seeing everyone next week.